Okay. This is.
You have to talk right into it.
This is, in many ways, a talk that I did not want to write and don't particularly want to deliver, but I sort of felt I had no choice to take up this subject. I want to talk about the classroom and about its invasion by anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic rhetoric. And I'm going to raise the question and identify the problem, and I'm not necessarily going to provide any definitive solutions because I don't have them yet, but I'm struggling with it. We know that BDS often takes over the public spaces on American campuses and drives pro-Israeli students to retreat to their Chabad or Hillel chapters or to their work in engineering or the sciences. But the impact of BDS has been deeper. It's turned some entire academic departments and disciplines against Israel and turned some faculty members in the humanities and soft social sciences into anti-Israel fanatics. Anecdotal evidence suggests this trend has spread to the classroom itself. We can see the results in some classroom assignments and in the level of unqualified hostility to Israel some faculty express in their public statements. When faculty members say publicly that Israel is a settler colonialist and apartheid state, I think we have reasons to suspect they believe these are factual statements, not hypotheses to be debated. And some are likely to present these political opinions as fact in the classroom lectures as well, and to ask their students to agree with them. When UC Santa Barbara sociology professor Bill Robinson sent an email to his 2009 Sociology of Globalization course that juxtaposed photos of the 2008-9 Israeli Gaza incursion paralleling photographs of German occupation of the Warsaw Ghetto during World War II, people urged he be fired. I deplored his Nazi Israel comparisons as irresponsible history, but I added that academic freedom protected his right as a tenured faculty member to say such things. Were he a job candidate, I would also have defended his right to say what he pleased, but I certainly would not have hired him. At the same time, I argued in part that you can't fire someone for saying things that are commonplace in given academic disciplines. I consider comparisons between Israel and Nazi Germany to be despicable, but they weren't rogue opinion in 2009, and they're certainly not rogue opinion now. Indeed, you get them in Israel. We've long passed the point where claims that Israel is a settler colonialist apartheid state are outlying opinion. The BDS movement has helped install these claims as self-evident truths, and that means that faculty members feel free, indeed often feel responsible, to treat them as self-evident claims and to resist countering student opinion. The Robinson case concerns an explicit communication with the students in his class. A more complex issue concerns the relationship between public castigation of Israel and classroom assignments. In February 2016, a tenured Rutgers University faculty member presented a talk at Vassar College devoted to a claim that Israel has a formal policy of comprehensively maiming and stunting the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. She added to it a claim that Israel harvests the organs of dead Palestinians. There are conspiracy theories that obsessively find clues everywhere. The Conspiracy Project, is to interpret myriad facts through a paranoid lens that turns them into proof. And there are projects like this one that find evidence, let alone proof as ordinarily understood, irrelevant. Neither proof nor evidence was at stake in the blood libel still alive in Arab countries. The Jews added Christian blood to matzah dough. The existence of the matzah itself was all that was needed for anti-Semites to imagine any ingredient and add it rhetorically to matzah's preparation. And so with women's studies professor Jasper Puar, some Palestinians are maimed in confrontations with the IDF. So by extension, Israel obviously wants to maim them all. Perfectly logical. From her perspective, there's no need to find documents supporting such a policy. All you have to do is play out a certain logic behind the slander. One can respond by marshaling counter-evidence. Her claims about excessive birth defects and stunting in Gaza can actually be disproven by evidence. The statistical evidence refutes her assertions, but her accusations will be spread and welcomed, and they will appear in classrooms around the country. Jasper Puar represents the lunatic fringe of the BDS movement, but many in the audience at Vassar applauded her, and others around the country have deplored accusations about the anti-Semitic character of her work, as though criticism of Puar's claims amounts to an attack on academic freedom, which of course completely misconstrues the concept. In fact, faculty have a responsibility to condemn slander packaged as academic reasoning. We have a responsibility to deplore the impact her work has on the impressionable students who applaud at her talks. Unfortunately, the lunatic fringe is welcomed throughout the BDS movement, and that's increasingly at the heart of the matter. So let's try an thought experiment. Do we suppose Puar would feel compelled in teaching about Gaza and the West Bank to reframe what she presents in lectures as true and treat it as hypothetical in the classroom? There was certainly no hint in her lecture that she felt the charges of stunting and maiming were open to debate. But as I said, these claims represent the lunatic fringe. What about the elements of BDS belief I mentioned earlier that are shared by virtually all of its loyal soldiers? Add to those the claim that Zionism equals racism. It's not that long ago when that motto was considered an outlier in the humanities as a whole, despite its adoption by parts of the left. Evidence that students have been affected by campus assertions like that are now commonplace. At the December 2014 annual meeting of the American Anthropological Association, those of us in attendance were confronted by hundreds of ferociously anti-Israel young graduate students excitedly voting for a resolution, excitedly voting down a resolution opposing academic boycotts. They were spurred on by faculty presenting anti-Israel papers at formal sessions. My favorite was a paper reporting that Jews and non-Jews are decisively separated on arrival at Ben Gurion Airport. That slander was met with applause. That was a tenured faculty member. A year later, those same faculty and graduate students voted for an academic boycott by a margin of 10-1. That was a rout. All these young students did not acquire their convictions exclusively at extracurricular sessions. They had to be carefully taught to echo the most telling song from the musical South Pacific. When a boycott resolution came up for debate on a California State University campus last year, students reported to me that faculty members in an extremely wide range of disciplines used classroom time to urge students to vote for the boycott resolution. Some, I am told, refused to let students opposing the boycott resolution have an occasion to speak in class. That is an unambiguous violation of academic freedom. At the January 2016 meeting of the Modern Language Association, both I and others routinely met pro-Israeli graduate students and young faculty who were afraid to attend sessions devoted to boycott discussion for fear that if they were seen there, people that they know could ask them their opinion, thereby jeopardizing their careers. And at that same meeting, when an anti-BDS speaker, actually Gabe Brahm, accused the BDS movement of anti-Semitism, the 70 BDS supporters in the room broke out in spontaneous laughter. For years, I have warned people that accusations of anti-Semitism meet with outrage, denial, and anger. Perhaps we've turned the corner, and now laughter has replaced anger. I'm in the midst of gathering the stories of pro-Israeli grad students and young faculty who've decided not to go into Israel studies for fear they would never get a job in departments or academic fields now dominated by BDS. All this is supplemental to the widely reported anti-Jewish atmosphere in public spaces reported on campus by many undergraduates. An undergrad can often keep his or her head down, retreat to Hillel or Chabad to avoid hostile social confrontations. An undergrad can probably move on with his or her life after graduation. A prejudicial classroom, however, is an entirely different matter. It shapes the perception of intellectual life long term. So too, obviously, do decisions about what kind of career, what kind of work will be the focus of the rest of your life. And meeting young faculty who say they were going to specialize in Israel studies, but decided they couldn't afford to do so, and have actually made a different career choice, not following their hearts, is now commonplace throughout the academy. So I believe we've reached a tipping point in the politicization of the humanities and the soft social science disciplines, not only here, but also in Britain and perhaps in some European countries. It's helpful to step back a moment and remember that it is more than 30 years since we have largely completed the disciplinarization of the academy. Instead of thinking of themselves as members of the professoriate as a whole, faculty members think of themselves more so as members of the engineering, computer, anthropology, or English profession. Many disciplines present an inadequate, uninformed, or misleading knowledge base on which to judge a complex historical, political, religious conflict like the one we are concerned with. And yet the ethics of disciplinarity essentially says that you are only bound to teach both sides of an issue when disciplinary consensus does not exist. A biologist does not have to give equal time to those who oppose the theory of evolution, even if the biologist lives in Kansas. A historian has no reason even to mention Holocaust denial. A sociologist might be expected to cover debates about global warming, but a climate scientist could well choose either to give bare mention of disbelievers in global warming or to make it clear that truth resides on only one side of the debate. So what I'm suggesting is that some disciplines, without having the requisite expertise, have reached a consensus about the truth of Israel and the truth of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I also believe the number of disciplines and sub-disciplines where the balance has been tipped and consensual anti-Israel truth reigns is increasing. A political scientist might recognize the need to acknowledge both the Israeli and Palestinian narratives and treat them each as possessing a degree of validity. In cultural anthropology, throughout literary studies and ethnic studies, in much of African American studies, Native American studies, and women's studies, and of course throughout Mideast studies, that is simply no longer the case. In many areas of the academy, there is substantial social and professional support for faculty devoted to demonizing the Jewish state. They feel justice and the truth of history resides entirely on one side of the conflict, and they feel quite righteous in teaching from that perspective. They also may have no awareness whatsoever at that point that they have turned their classrooms into propaganda machines. It may not cross their minds. Unfortunately, BDS's lunatic fringe is increasingly in evidence in some disciplines. What still counts as unquestioned lunacy, like, say, Joy Carriga at Oberlin, meanwhile helps make somewhat less rabid opposition to Israel seem reasonable. I don't believe Joy Carriga could get applause, or hope she couldn't, from a general audience for her claim that the Mossad was behind the Charlie Hebdo massacre, or for continuing to promote the lunacy that Israel was behind the support on the World Trade Towers. But Puar's madness was well received by some. The lopsided votes in favor of academic boycotts in some disciplines are a good indication of the state not only of political, but also, I believe, pedagogical consensus. In some disciplines, the balance of power is local. A given department may have jettisoned differences of opinion and a climate for debate that prevail in the discipline at large. Jewish studies is a particularly telling example of that phenomenon. For a few Jewish studies programs have become centers of anti-Israel politics and conviction, including the one on my own campus. I've long argued that requiring individual colleagues to make an effort to portray both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is pointless. Would there be any point in saying to Jasper Puar or Joy Carriga, we want you to present both sides of the issues? I mean, do you think they would do a responsible job of doing that? Would it help matters at all for them to try to require them to be balanced? Would it help to ask David Lloyd, David Palumbo-Leo, Bill Mullen, Stephen Salaita to to present the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a balanced manner. I'd rather that they simply offered thoroughly prejudiced opinion. At least then it would be stark, and there wouldn't be any illusion that they were presenting both sides of the case. There might be more clarity for students if these tenured faculty simply embodied their unqualified malice in their teaching. But then we will have great need to make certain that teaching based on mutual empathy is also powerfully in evidence. That's part of our responsibility, to make sure that ethically and historically compromised teaching is met on campus by teaching of a much higher caliber. I don't believe we can win the debate by countering pro-Palestinian fanaticism with pro-Israeli fanaticism. The best that does is strengthen or install ideological war on campus. And in too many disciplines, we would lose that war, including my own. Indeed, in many quarters, the war is already lost. There are both moral and tactical reasons to choose another way. But we must also forthrightly confront the demonization of Israel where it occurs. Faculty can voice their political opinions in class if those opinions are germane to the subject matter, but they must welcome open debate from their students. If they repress, ridicule, or disparage opposing student opinion, then those faculty should risk exposure and sanction. That's the point at which they violate academic freedom, when they suppress alternative student opinion. Even in classes not relevant to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, faculty can share their views if the subject comes up, which it may, but the same requirement to welcome alternative viewpoints applies. Persistently using a class on an entirely unrelated topic, say you have a class on home economics or veterinary science, and you begin every class with an attack on Israel, that's a violation of your professional responsibilities. But if there's a debate on campus, you could engage that topic, even with no relation to your subject matter, as long as you don't do so persistently. That was the AEUP's modification of bringing in unrelated topics to a classroom in its 1970 modification. Persistence, occasional yes, persistence, unacceptable if it's not related to the subject matter of the class. We must remember that many faculty members with strong views on the subject teach in fields with no connection to the conflict, and it is fair to assume most of those faculty never deal with it in class. Many faculty members keep their politics separate from their teaching and are quite capable, say, of signing a pro-BDS or pro-Israeli petition without bringing their views to class or trying to persuade students to adopt them. A faculty bias against sharing political opinion with students still carries a good weight in the academy. But anti-Israel passion is seriously eroding that tradition in many fields. If you believe Israel is the root of all evil in the world, as some on the left do, then that conviction can trump all the restraints on propagandizing that have sustained the profession for so long. Unfortunately, as I travel around the country, I'm convinced the tide has begun to turn on the system of values and restraints that have long shaped the ethics of teaching. And I believe the prevalence of vicious anti-Israel classroom proselytizing is increasing and will continue to increase. At the anthropology meeting last year, I encountered grad students who seemed to be basically brainwashed, and it is rather worrying that they are the next generation of teachers. I don't obviously welcome Israel being demonized, but I also have long argued that articulate, rational, well-supported advocacy has a place in the academy. Students benefit from hearing faculty members defend their political views with reason, with evidence, with diminished passion. They learn something about advocacy that way that they can use in the rest of their lives, even if it's advocacy that differs from them. But that's one kind of advocacy that has nothing to do with efforts to intimidate and terrorize students with anti-Israel opinion. Good advocacy can help students see what academia brings to controversy that, say, Washington politics often does not. But I did not have in mind David Palumbo-Liu's opportunistic anti-Israel sarcasm, or David Lloyd's anti-Israel harangues, let alone Puar's elaborate hate-based conspiracy theories, or Kariga's anti-Semitic demagoguery. And it doesn't help matters that students at Oberlin included a demand that Kariga be automatically granted tenure among the list of demands they gave the college president without any kind of proper tenure review process. At least in some quarters on the American campus, there really are no limits to the venom that will be collectively embraced. I'm not going to have time to go into Kariga in detail, but I have looked at her Facebook posts, and I've looked at one of her syllabi in detail, and it's an interesting case because she teaches a course on the use of social media. Given that, is it unlikely that her own paranoid social media posts would never come up in class, that the students would never ask her to talk about them? I think it's likely they have, and that actually is a basis to go after her during a third-year review or a tenure process, because then she's not using the standards of evidence in the classroom that one would expect of an Oberlin, I hope, faculty member, especially teaching a class that's Introduction to Rhetoric, that's for students throughout the campus, and therefore not only in her own department, but to other faculty and other departments have a vested interest in her following certain standards of evidence and reason in her classroom. It's not specialized courses, they're courses for everybody. So what do we do? Well, sometimes it's a case-by-case question, and one has to deal with special cases. There's obviously a huge difference between someone who's a job candidate, someone who is a candidate for tenure, and someone who is a tenured faculty member. And the things one can do vary progressively with those series of categories. With tenured faculty, mostly you have counter discourse as your option. I think I'm out of time. Thank you.